Hi there, everybody. Good evening. We're now going to start the final discussion in our series, which we've taken a very small topic in Jewish practice, in halacha. It happens to be a detail from the laws of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is long over, but it doesn't matter. It's just an example so that we can gain an understanding of not so much to understand the laws of Hanukkah. That's not the purpose of our discussion. The purpose of our discussion is to understand how Jewish law operates. Where does Jewish law come from and how it develops and evolves? What are the different sources of Jewish law and who are the different personalities which shaped Jewish law? So we've taken a very particular example here. And we started off by taking a look in the passage in the Talmud, which discusses this particular detail. It happens to be that since it deals with Hanukkah, it's post-biblical. And therefore, we don't have to start with the Torah itself. We examined that passage in the Talmud on its own merits. That is, that we took a look at what it means, just the different parshanut, the different explanation of that passage in the Talmud. After that, we then started our discussion of, well, how do we get from this passage in the Talmud to a codified law? And that's what we're in the middle of now. So let's do a very quick review. And this is going to be a very bottom line review. And God bless our holy Kli Kodesh, our holy vessel, who Leib Shlomo, who is my faithful Gabbai and Baal Koreh extraordinaire, etc., that he never loses his patience, with me at least. So even though this is sort of schlepped out over quite a long time, but in his smiley, tolerant self, he doesn't get angry at me. I'm sick of this, Rabbi. I'm tired of talking about a detail of Hanukkah in the month of Shvat. Okay. God bless you. And everybody else for that matter. Okay. So just the bottom line in terms of the Talmudic discussion. The Talmud was discussing the inferior wicks and oils which are used, could have been used for lighting Shabbat candles, but they're precluded from being used because they're inferior nature. Are those inferior wicks and oils allowed to be used for lighting Hanukkah candles? That was the question the Talmud is asking. And it turns out, shock, 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 it's a dispute, a machloket or machloikus, however you pronounce those words, depending upon your custom. So we had three opinions. These opinions divided up two parts of Hanukkah with regards to this particular detail. One of them is to light on a normal evening of Hanukkah, and the other one is on Friday night, because there's particular concerns when you're lighting on Friday night, which goes into Shabbat. Okay? So every possible way of approaching this problem is found in the Talmud. There are three opinions. The first opinion was Rav Huna. And those of you who have the English or the Hebrew for that matter can follow along there. I'm not going to read it inside, just the bottom line. Rav Huna said that those wicks and oils, which we don't use for Shabbat, so we don't use them for Hanukkah either. Whether it's, I'll just as an example, Tuesday night or Friday night, right? Bein b'Shabbat, bein b'chol. Okay. The second opinion was Rav Chisda, who said those inferior wicks and oils that we don't use for Shabbat candles, so those can be used on Tuesday night for Hanukkah candles, but not on Friday night. Okay. Now, the third opinion is the opinion of Rav, and Rav says those inferior wicks and oils which don't use for Shabbat candles, so with regard are fine, whether it's on Tuesday night or Friday night. So we actually have every single possible combination here, going from extreme to extreme with a middle opinion. So an opinion says that those wicks and oils which are invalid for Shabbat are invalid for Hanukkah too, whether it's Tuesday night or Friday night. Then the opposite, those wicks and oils which are inferior for Shabbat can be used for Hanukkah 100%, no problem. Either Tuesday night or Friday night. And then the middle opinion, which was Rav Chisda, that said that those inferior wicks and oils, that they can be used for Tuesday night, but not Friday night. Now, the reason we already discussed in previous discussions. I don't want to go over that right now. Then we saw that the Talmud relates an incident where some rabbis came before the esteemed sage Abaye and related the opinion, which was the most lenient opinion, the opinion of Rav. Rav, who said that those inferior wicks and oils can be used on Tuesday night or Friday night for Hanukkah candles. And they related it to Abaye. And after a little detour where Abaye heard it in the name of one rabbi and then rejected it, but he heard it in the name of another rabbi and then accepted it. So the Talmud concludes saying that Abaye accepted this ruling, the liberal ruling, the lenient ruling, that those inferior wicks and oils can be used whether Tuesday night or Friday night. Abaye accepted that particular ruling, and he regretted that he didn't accept it the first time he heard it. Okay, then there was one more passage in the Talmud which is significant for our discussion, and that is the Talmud asked a question. The question was that one of the issues, underlying issues in this particular three-way dispute is, what's the essence of the mitzvah? Is the essence of the mitzvah the lighting, or is it that the candle remain burning, right? What happens if you lit it and it went out, right? You have to relight it, okay? So the lenient opinion that we discussed just a moment ago held the opinion that kafta ein zakukla, that if the candle goes out, you don't have to relight it. And the Talmud says, that doesn't really make sense. Why? Because we know of a tradition that says that the mitzvah Hanukkah candles extends from this time of the setting of the sun until the last person leaves the shopping mall. Okay, so doesn't that seem to indicate that the candle has to do the mitzvah? It's not just a matter of lighting it. It has to actually remain burning. So the Talmud said, well, not necessarily so, because perhaps when it said that the mitzvah is from the setting of the sun to the last person leaves the shopping mall, that's referring to the time period in which you can do the mitzvah, not that it has to remain lit during that period. Or perhaps that phrase that the Hanukkah candle, the mitzvah is from the setting of the sun until the last person leaves the shopping mall, maybe that's to tell you how much oil you have to put in the candle in order to fulfill the mitzvah, but it doesn't actually mean it has to burn that long, but at least it has to have the potential. So with reference to the measure of oil that's put in. So if you accept either of those two interpretations of that particular tradition, then they are not contradicting the principle that the mitzvah really is to light it, and it actually does not have to burn for any period of time. It's enough just to light it. Of course, it doesn't mean you should blow it out the moment you light it, right? But if in case it happens, you don't have to relight it. Okay, fine. Now, what we started to discuss last week is, it's a three-way dispute. Can you use inferior wicks and oils on Hanukkah? Well, great. We're here in the holy city of Sacramento, and we want to know, there's a sale at the local store on inferior wicks and oils. We'd like to save some money. Can we use those inferior wicks and oils for our Hanukkah candles? Well, if you look in the Talmud, we're a little perplexed, because it happens to be that there are three opinions: yes, no, and maybe. Right? Right? Rav Huna said no, and Rav said yes, and Rav Chitza said maybe. Depends upon whether it's Tuesday night or Friday night. Tuesday night is okay, Friday night is not okay. Well, now I'm perplexed, so I want to know what to do. So how do we deal with that? So what we started to do was examine the three pillars of the codes that we find in the early Middle Ages. Now, there are many codes and many commentaries that were written in the Middle Ages. We are particularly focusing on three for a reason. The reason is because when we look forward in Jewish history, the great law code Shulchan Aruch, which we'll talk about today a little bit, that particular law code, the author says that and that law code became sort of the ultimate pillar of of Jewish law. It was written in the 16th century. Rabbi Yosef Karo will talk more a little bit later about it. But he says there that he's going to decide what the law is based upon three particular codes of Jewish law. Those three particular codes of Jewish law were the code of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, who, as we mentioned last time, lived in Algeria, born in 1013, died in Spain in 1103. And the second code of Jewish law, which the author of the Shulchan Aruch is going to consider, is the great code of Maimonides, the Rambam, his great law code, the Mishneh Torah. The Rambam, born in Spain and died in Egypt, born in 1135, died in 1204. And the third law code that the Shulchan Aruch considers to be essential is that of the Rosh, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. He was born in Germany in 1250 and died in Spain in 1327. So because those three law codes are sort of the primary legs of this edifice of the Shulchan Aruch, the great 16th century law code, so we've been focusing particularly on those particular codes. So last time we met, we actually talked a little bit about the first one, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, and we actually looked at how he treats this particular halacha here. Can you use inferior wicks and oils? And we noticed that he borrows the language of the Talmud. He essentially quotes the Talmud, but does something very interesting. He only quotes one opinion of the Talmud, but it's almost a word-for-word quote of the Talmud. So he doesn't state the law as a kind of abstraction. He kind of cuts and pastes, right? He just sort of cut out one particular opinion of the Talmud and presents that as being the law. That is very typical for what Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi does. When you take a look at his commentary, it looks like the Talmud. And we even mentioned last time that some people call it Shas Katan, like a miniature Talmud, because he borrows the language of the Talmud and doesn't reformulate it most of the time. It's a word, more or less word for word quote, but only the bottom line, the opinion that he thinks is the halacha. Now, I just want to show you what the Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif for short, what it looks like. So this is a volume of Talmud here. Okay, just pulled one off the shelf randomly. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi's law code is so significant, it's printed in the back of every volume of a standard edition of the Talmud. So when we open it up, right, that's what it looks like. Now the funny thing is, if you just sort of, even if you can't read it, it kind of has a distinctive layout. But if you, now I'm going to turn just to the Talmud itself. It looks just like it. Okay. Not only does it look like it graphically, but it's actually the language itself of the Talmud. Now, which of the three opinions did Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi accept? The opinion which was the lenient opinion. Okay, that was the opinion of Rav. Now, what we noticed last time, this is the last thing we mentioned, is Yitzchak Alfasi doesn't say why he chose that opinion of the three, right? There's three opinions, right? There's everything is forbidden, everything is permitted, and maybe. These oils and wicks are permitted on Tuesday, but not Friday. So why do you choose the most lenient opinion? He doesn't explain. Okay. Now we're going to try to wrestle with that today. Now the second leg that we're going to be discussing is the leg of the Rosh, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. Now the Rosh is extremely important for obvious reasons. He's one of the three stools upon which the edifice of the Shulchan Aruch rests. But he's important for some more important reason than that, and that is the following. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, called Rosh for short, he comes out of the tradition of the Franco-German school of Talmudic scholarship. That is the great Talmudic learning which Rashi represents and the next few generations after Rashi. That's a very distinctive school of thought and approach towards the Talmud, and it's emerging in a Western European context, France and Germany. Rashi's from France, right? The Rosh himself is from Germany. So he's part of that tradition. Some of you may have heard of the term Tosafot. So the rabbis that are quoted in this anthology of Talmudic commentary, which is called Tosafot, they are part of that school of thought. We call it the Franco-German school of thought from the time of Rashi for the next couple of hundred years. So he represents this sort of European, Western European development of halakha and practice, but he flees Germany. He flees Germany because it became too dangerous to live in Germany for Jews. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? And he goes to Spain. Now, Spain is its own school of Talmudic scholarship. Spain is part of the Talmudic scholarship that flows from the academies in Babylonia, through the great scholars that lived in North Africa, like Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi that we just mentioned before. And the great Jewish community in Spain is part of that tradition. They have their own way of approaching the Talmud and their own practices, customs that have evolved. So he's kind of a crossover personality because he emerges out of the Franco-German world, but becomes a very prominent rabbi of Spanish Jewry. So in his particular law code, he has not only the views of the Franco-German Jewish community, but also the Sephardic Jewish community. Now, in his particular code here, it sounds a lot like that of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. Let's read. I'm going to read this in Hebrew and translate it where it says Rosh. There, everybody got that out there? Okay, no pushing. There's enough chairs. Okay, now, the Rosh says the following. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav Matna, Amar Rav Petitlot Ushmanim, Shamru Chachamim en Madlikim behen b'Shabbat, Madlikim behen b'Chanukah, ben b'Chol ben b'Shabbat. So, it's a word-for-word quote from the Talmud. Rabbi Zera said, in the name of Rav Matna, in the name of Rav, right? It's Rav, the third opinion, which was the most lenient opinion, that those inferior wicks and oils that are not allowed to use on Shabbat, we are allowed to use them on Hanukkah, whether it's Tuesday night or Friday night. Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle. This sounds almost exactly like that of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi of the Rif, and it's also written in the style of the Rif. That is, it's a word-for-word quote of the Talmud. Okay? And he goes on to quote the continuation of the Talmud, where the Talmud raised the question of how could it be that if it burns out, you don't have to relight it, in light of the fact that there's a halacha, a law that says that the mitzvah of the Hanukkah candle is from sunset until the last person leaves the shopping mall. That whole question and answer that the Talmud presented, which we already discussed, and he quotes that. Okay, so in this particular case, the Rif and the Rosh very much sound familiar, both in terms of content and in terms of style. That is, it's a kind of paraphrase of the Talmudic discussion. It's in the order of the Talmudic discussion, and it serves the law code because the author, the Rosh, selects out only those passages in the Talmud which represent what he feels is the halakha. Here too, there's no explanation why the Rosh chose that most lenient view, the view of Rav, that those inferior wicks and oils, which you're not allowed to use on Shabbat, you are allowed to use on Hanukkah, no matter what. Well, we have one more leg of this three-legged stool, which upon rests really most of halacha, and that is the Rambam, the great Maimonides. Now, the Rambam, it's really hard to think of a rabbi who has been more influential than the Rambam. As a matter of fact, People say about the Rambam, and I believe it's on his tombstone, though I'm sure he didn't choose this inscription, that from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses, right? His name was Moses, Moshe. So from biblical Moshe to this Moshe, there's never another one like him. And there is some profound truth to that. The Rambam, born in Spain, dies in Egypt, as mentioned before, 12th century, writes the tremendous law code called the Mishneh Torah. Now here we are breaking totally with the pattern that we saw before in terms of writing style and organization. So let's read what he has to say. We'll read it in Hebrew and translate it. Kol hashmanim v'kol hapitilot ksherot l'ner Chanukah. All oils and wicks are kosher are fit for lighting the Hanukkah candle, right? That's just like we saw in the Rif and the Rosh, except for, you notice what he doesn't do? Does not quote the Talmud at all. There's no paraphrase of Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rav, right? It just says what the halacha is. All the wicks and oils are fit for Hanukkah candle. Okay. And then he goes on with a little bit of detail. Even though these oils don't get absorbed particularly well into the wicks, and the fire is not particularly stable in those particular wicks, you're still allowed to use them. Even on Friday night, within the middle of Hanukkah, you're allowed to use those. Shabbat, even though you wouldn't be able to use those inferior ones for the Shabbat candles. Why? Because you're not allowed to use the light. We had discussed this previously, and therefore there's no fear that you'll tilt the candle on Friday night. Where you can't even use the light for counting money, etc. Okay, can't use that light. So what we see here is the Rambam took a totally different approach stylistically in writing his law code. He does not go in order of the Talmud, and he does not quote the Talmud at all. What the Rambam did was to attempt to take the entirety of halakha, the entirety of Jewish practice, and put it in a blender and reformulate it in a way which is super user-friendly. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi and the Rosh are not user-friendly. They write in the language of the Talmud. As a matter of fact, it's usually a quote. If you want to know where to look up a halakha, not so simple, because their law code is arranged in the order of the pages of the Talmud. It's a little hard to know where to find things. The Rambam is not like that. The Rambam sat down. He organized all of Jewish law into 14 categories. And each of those 14 categories has subcategories, perfectly systematic. You know where to find every single thing. He does not use the language of the Talmud at all. He does not use Aramaic. He uses beautiful Hebrew, which is very much like the Hebrew of the Mishnah. Beautiful Mishnaic Hebrew. Does not quote sources, does not quote personalities. He just lays out the law systematically. And the Rambam writes that he wanted to be able to create a work which would allow us to understand the entirety of Jewish tradition of the oral law without confusion, that we know exactly where to look for it, and in a style that we can understand. And he was phenomenally successful. Now, that doesn't mean he wasn't criticized. He was actually criticized very heavily for not quoting sources. A little hard to argue with somebody who doesn't quote sources. Maybe there are other rabbis who disagree with what he has to say. But how do you pick a fight with somebody who doesn't quote sources, right? So that's one of the criticism leveled against the Rambam. In any case here, Not surprisingly, he doesn't explain why he also accepted the opinion of Rav, the most lenient opinion. So let's just review now. We went through the three pillars: Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, and the Rambam, right? The Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam. Okay? Those three stools write in different styles, right? The first two, Rif and the Rosh, essentially quote the Talmud, but only quote the passage which is the law. But in this particular case, no explanation of why they choose that particular approach. The Rambam, on the other hand, writes with a very different style, uses this pure, beautiful Mishnaic Hebrew, reorganized the order of all of the laws, doesn't quote any sources. But bottom line is that they all three legs of the stool chose the most lenient opinion in this particular case. The opinion says those inferior wicks and oils are all kosher for the mitzvah of Hanukkah. Okay. Now, we are still a bit stumped as to why that particular opinion was accepted. We're going to, by the time we're done tonight, Bezrat Hashem, we'll explain it. Now we're going to go to the next step. What happened in halachic history, the history of Jewish practice, from this time, these three great pillars? Well, it's a lot more complicated than I'm making it, but if you want to look at it in the most broad way, broad strokes, remember the Rosh that we just talked about, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel? Well, he had some sons. One of them was named Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. His father's name was Asher, Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. He was a student of his father, not surprisingly, and he decided to write a law code which would be inspired by his father's code, but he would write it in a way which is more like the Rambam, meaning in the respect that it's not a running commentary on the Talmud, right? It's not written in the order of the Talmud. It's synthetically organized like the Rambam. But unlike the Rambam, who created 14 different categories and then subcategories, he creates 4 big categories. And he calls his work the Arba'at Turim, the 4 columns. Okay? 4 columns because it's the 4 categories of Jewish law. And he organizes all of practical Jewish law under those 4 categories. See, the Rambam codified all Jewish tradition, even if it's not relevant today. Like the laws of sacrifices aren't operative right now. Maybe tomorrow, but not today. But the Rambam included them, whereas Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, in his Arba'at Turim, his 4 columns, he only includes those laws which are operative. So he doesn't have anything about the laws of sacrifice, as an example. Now, those 4 columns are Orach Chaim, which deals with daily laws, Shabbat laws, holidays. Yoreh De'ah, that's the second, which deals with kashrut, keeping kosher, oaths, the laws of family purity, mourning, etc. The third is called Even HaEzer, which deals with family life, marriage and divorce. And the fourth is called Choshen Mishpat, which deals with tort law, business law. Okay? So this momentous work has extraordinary importance, because as the son of the Rosh, he has that broad scope, both the Ashkenazi, European, Franco-German traditions, because he was also born in Germany with his father, right? His father lived in Germany, and he lived in Germany. But then the family fled to Spain. So he has both this exposure to the Franco-German practices, but then also the Sephardi, the Spanish practices, North Africa and into Babylonia. But he also is the next generation after his father, obviously. And so he incorporates a broader spectrum, sources that his father didn't quote. He's coming a generation later, and there are more sources that he's been exposed to, more practices. So it's more encyclopedic than his father's law code, than the Rosh's law code. So Arba'at Turim is essentially an encyclopedic code of Jewish law written in a rather user-friendly style because of the fact that it's topically organized rather than organized by the pages of the Talmud. Okay. Now let's read the salient passage from the Arba Turim on our particular issue. Next page, where it says Torah at the top. Kol shemanim v'patilot ksherim la bein b'chol bein b'shabbat. All of the wicks and oils are kosher, whether we're talking about Tuesday night or Friday night. Af p'sulin ner shel Shabbat, even if those same wicks and oils would have been not kosher for a Shabbat candle, but here they are kosher for Hanukkah. She'ein oran yafeh v'she'ein Hashem nimshach achar patilah, that even though the flame is not stable, etc., they're still kosher. By the way, this sounds just like the language of the Rambam. Okay, so he often quotes the Rambam. Okay, so it's kosher. Okay, fine. Well, here we see again that no explanation given. He's adopting, not surprisingly, the lenient view, because everybody before him did, but no particular explanation. Now here's where we start to gather a lot of steam. Along comes a very great rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo was born in Spain in 1488. He flees Spain in 1492, not surprisingly. All Jews, right? That was a big trauma. Jews were forced to either become Catholic or to flee. His family moves to Turkey, along with many other thousands of Jews. And then ultimately he moves to Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel, and settles in Sfat. In Sfat, he becomes a member of the great rabbinic court in Sfat, and he works on a stupendous commentary on the Arba Turim, because the Arba Turim is this encyclopedic, well-organized work about Jewish law. And it is a great place to start a discussion of any particular topic in Jewish law. So he writes a commentary on the Arba Turim, and he calls that commentary Beit Yosef, the house of Joseph. His name was Yosef. His name was Joseph. Amazingly enough, he spends 20 years working on his commentary on the Arba Turim. After he finishes it, he works on it another 12 years to make some additions and subtractions. And this became an instant hit. So the Beit Yosef commentary from Rabbi Yosef Karo, which is the commentary on the Arba Turim of Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. And in this commentary, he takes every issue mentioned by the Arba Turim, but traces it to its source, tells you alternative opinions, explains why that's the halacha, etc. So by studying the Arba Turim with the commentary of Beit Yosef, one develops a mastery of almost the entire expanse of Jewish practice and Jewish development, the development of Jewish practice. So let's take a look at what the Beit Yosef says on this particular issue. Now remember, the Arba Turim said that all those wicks and oils that are not kosher for Shabbat, they are kosher for Hanukkah. Not surprisingly, everybody else said that too, based upon one of the three opinions in the Talmud, which we don't know why that opinion was chosen. So the first thing that the Beit Yosef does is he quotes that particular passage from the Arba Turim. Kol shemanim v'patilot ksherim la bein b'chol bein b'shabbat. Okay, that all of those wicks and oils which are inferior, not allowed to use in Shabbat, they are allowed to be allowed to use in Hanukkah. Okay, that's just quoting from the Arba Turim. Now here the Beit Yosef comments. You see, the Tur didn't say where that came from, the Arba Turim. We call it Tur for short. The Tur didn't say where it came from. Along comes the Beit Yosef. Plug to Damorai beperet b'mamadikim. So Rabbi Yosef Karo says in his commentary, Beit Yosef, on the Arba Turim, this particular ruling is in fact a dispute of the Amoraim, the rabbis coming from the time of the Talmud, in the chapter of Tractate Shabbat, Masechet Shabbat, entitled Bamet Madikin, Umashma B'Gemara, and it seems apparent in the Talmud, the Hilchata Karav, that the law is like the third opinion, the lenient opinion. The Amar Ptilot Shmanim Shamru Chachamim and Madikin Behem B'Shabbat, Madikin Behem B'Chanukah Ben B'Chol Ben B'Shabbat. Those inferior wicks and oils that we don't use for Shabbat, you can use them for Hanukkah, whether you're talking about Tuesday night or Friday night. Now, look what he did. He gave the source of the ruling. Not only that, he mentions that it's not a unified, unanimous opinion in the Talmud. It's actually a three-way dispute. But he says it's apparent from the Talmud itself that this is, in fact, the halacha, this particular lenient ruling. Now, I'm just going to take a break now for 2 minutes, okay? And I'll be right back. Okay? Don't go away. Get your cup of coffee. No, just leave it like that. But whatever you say is going to be recorded for posterity. He's back. Now, Rabbi Yosef Karo just told us that it seems from the Talmudic discussion, he says, that the halakha is in accordance with the lenient view. He doesn't actually amplify. But at least he said, you can tell from the Talmudic discussion that that's the halakha. What I'd like for everybody to do is take out the passage of the Talmud again. Let's see if we can speculate how you can tell from the Talmudic discussion itself that the halakha is like the third opinion, Rav's opinion, that those non-kosher oils for Shabbat are kosher for Hanukkah, whether Tuesday night or Friday night. Okay, now, there are three views here. Rav Huna, who said, never kosher. Rav Chisda, who said, kosher on Tuesday but not Friday. And Rav, who said that they're always kosher. First of all, let's put those in some type of historical context or chronological order. Guess what? Rav Huna and Rav Chisda were both students of Rav. So of those three, Rav is the senior. He's actually the Rebbe. He's the teacher of Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Doesn't mean they're not allowed to disagree. They obviously do disagree. But he's the more senior personality. Okay. So perhaps that's one reason why we might prefer Rav's opinion over the other two, perhaps. But there's a dead giveaway, and that is from the next passage in the Talmud. Because after the three views were presented, the Talmud says that the view of Rav, the third opinion, right, who happened to be the teacher of the other two, that the opinion of Rav was brought before a rabbi who lived 100 years later. You see, Rav Huna and Rav Chisda, just to give you a sort of chronological sense, Rav Huna died in 296, the Common Era. Rav Chisda died in 320. They are both students in Babylonia, in the yeshiva of a town called Sura. And like I said, they are students of Rav. Now, Rav, who dies in the year 247, was the Rosh Yeshiva of Sura. As a matter of fact, he's the founder, I believe, of the yeshiva in Sura. Okay? Then the Talmud says that a bunch of rabbis brought the view of Rav before Abaye. Now, see, Abaye is also living in Babylonia. He dies in the year 338. So Abaye is living 100 years after Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, and Rav. Even more than 100 years relative to Rav, right? The Rav died in 247, and it's 100 years. And Abaye, he dies in 338. That's 100 years. Okay. So we're talking about 100 years in that's like 3 generations. You know, if you say generation is about 30 years, it's 3 generations later. They bring Rav's opinion before Abaye, and the Talmud says, V'kibla, he accepted it. And he regrets not having accepted the first time he heard it, if you remember. That's pretty much of a dead giveaway that the most contemporary authority mentioned in the Talmud, right? We're blasting forward 3 generations. Was aware of all 3 opinions. When the opinion of Rav was brought before him, Kibla, he accepted it. He paskined it. And there's no further discussion in the Talmud in terms of alternative views. The Talmud doesn't say, but a contemporary of Abaye said, oh, no, the halacha is not like Rav, it's like Rav Huna or Rav Chisda, right? You don't see that. Now, there's a very important principle in the deciding of Jewish law. It's called Hilchata Kivatrai, that within any given epoch of Jewish scholarship, the law, generally speaking, is like the most recent scholars. Now, I want to clarify what I mean by that. Within any given epoch. You see, a scholar from the time of the Talmud can't disagree with a rabbi from the time of the Mishnah, right? Unless he has an alternative opinion from the time of the Mishnah to rely upon. That's because they're living in 2 different epochs, right? So each epoch becomes sort of ultimately authoritative, and the subsequent epoch can't disagree with the previous epoch. And there aren't too many epochs in Jewish history. You have the Mishnah, right? The Tanaim, the rabbis who lived at that time. You have the Amoraim, right? And then you have what we call the Rishonim, the medieval scholars, right? Gonim are sort of, there's kind of a bridge there. That's a good point. And then you have the, after the time of the Rishonim, we call them the Achronim, the latter scholars. That's basically the 16th century on. Generally speaking, each of those categories doesn't disagree with the consensus of an opinion before it. Okay, but within any of those periods, the rabbis are free to disagree with each other, and the law, generally speaking, is like the most contemporary, the most recent opinion within that particular epoch. So when we take a look at this discussion, we're dealing with, as Rav Yosef Karl said in his Beit Yosef, his commentary on the Tur, he said, Plukta Damara, it's a dispute of Amoraim. So these are all Amoraim. Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, and Rav are all Amoraim, and Abaye. And the most contemporary of these opinions is Abaye. And Abaye says that the law is like Rav. And that's the end of the discussion. It's pretty clear that's what Rav Yosef Karo meant when he said, Mashma, it's apparent from the language of the Talmud itself, that the law is like the opinion of Rav. From the fact that Abaye, who's coming 100 years later, accepts that particular opinion. that pretty clear? So when you take a look at the Talmud, even though the Talmud doesn't yell out, the law is like Rav, but in a slightly more subtle way, it does say that in this particular case. Sometimes it's a little harder to decide what the law should be, but here there's more. It's pretty apparent that that's what the Talmud is saying. Now I'm going to add one more point to this, and it's not necessarily so convincing in this particular context, but in other contexts it becomes a factor, and that is the Talmud right after this raised a question. Part of Rav's approach was that the mitzvah is just to light the candle. It doesn't have to keep burning. So I said, how could you say that? We know that there's a tradition that says that the nature of the mitzvah is that it be from the beginning of sunset, from sunset until the last person leaves the shopping mall. So the Talmud said, oh, that's not to tell you it has to burn that period. It's just to tell you that you can light it within any time during that period, or that's how much oil has to be, right? That we mentioned before. So it's interesting. You notice the question asked by the Talmud is on a particular view, the view that says that if it goes out, you don't have to relight it. Sometimes that's an indication that when the Talmud attacks, as it were, a view, it's because the Talmud thinks that that view is probably the halakha. So we want to make sure that it can withstand any logical contradictions or attacks. So sometimes when the Talmud will attack a particular view, that itself is an indication that that view is in fact the halakha. So you could have intuitively thought the opposite. Well, if the Talmud starts attacking a view, that means it's kind of undermining it. No, on the contrary, the fact that it attacks that view is indicative many times that in fact is the halakha. Okay, now the Beit Yosef does a lot more, Rabbi Yosef Karo in his commentary on the Tur, than we just said now. He goes on and presents all kinds of other opinions. Let's read on just to give you a sampling. Varokeach, he quotes another scholar who's Katav Shemen Zaid Misamina Muchar. You know, we just said that any particular type of oil or wick is okay. But then he quotes the Rokeach, who is a part of the Franco-German school of thought from Worms in Germany. And the Rokeach said that even though really anything is kosher, but you know what? Shemen Zayit, olive oil, is the best. Can you imagine why olive oil is the best? So perhaps because it's most evocative of the menorah that was in the holy temple, the Beit HaMikdash, because that was olive oil. And then he goes on to quote other scholars who dealt with different aspects of issues that relate to this particular mitzvah. We're not going to go through it now because there's not enough time and I want to finish this. But you can see that the Beit Yosef, right? Yosef Karo's commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, on the Tur, is incredibly encyclopedic. It's a commentary on a work which itself is encyclopedic, but then he goes and shows the sources, discusses the logic, and then brings in opinions which didn't appear in the Arbaturim. Just bear in mind, you see, he's living later, right? So a lot has happened since the time of the author of the Arbaturim, the author of the Tur, and the 16th century was the time of the Beit Yosef. So as time goes on, and new practices develop and new opinions, exposure to different views. So there's a need to bring them into this encyclopedic approach and to consider them. So this is an extremely important work. Now, if you want to study anything in Jewish law, you take out the Tur and the Beit Yosef. That's how you do it, okay? If you go through the Tur and the Beit Yosef, you are going to have a firm grasp on any particular topic in Jewish law. Now, the Beit Yosef, after he spent, right, we mentioned 20 years it took him to write it and another 12 years of editing, 32 years, he said, you know what? You have to be pretty much of a scholar to be able to work through this. What about just a really super friendly, just bottom line, what's the halacha? So he wrote another work called Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch means set table. And there it just tells you the bottom line. No alternative opinions, generally speaking. No sources, right? Kind of like the style of the Rambam. He often actually quotes the Rambam word for word. Let's just read a little bit of the Shulchan Aruch. Kol hashmanim v'petilot ksherim l'ner Chanukah. All of the wicks and oils are kosher for Chanukah. Afal pi she'ein hashmanim nifshachim achar petila, even though it doesn't create a stable light. It's actually the language of the Rambam. Okay, so he's quoting that lenient opinion of Rav. Not surprisingly, he uses actually the language of the Rambam. Now, this great work, the Shulchan Aruch, became very well accepted. The problem is that Rav Yosef Karo himself was a Sephardi. As we mentioned, he was born in Spain, came to Turkey, and then to Eretz Israel. He doesn't always take consideration the great customs and authorities from the Franco-German school. So there was another scholar, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who was a contemporary but living in Poland. And part of that school of thought, the Franco-German school, when the Jews had moved further east, right, into Poland. And he wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, in which he brings in the Franco-German, and in this case, Polish, moving eastward. And let's read what he says there. His comments are actually interspersed into the text of the Shulchan Aruch. And Haga, a note. Umiu shemen zayit mitzvah min vuchar. The best is olive oil. You remember that comment? That actually was, in fact, a comment that the Beit Yosef had quoted in his commentary on the Tur, right? That it was quoted in the name of the Rokeach. But he didn't quote it, the Rabbi Yosef Karo didn't quote it in the Shulchan Aruch, because the Shulchan Aruch itself, which is just the bottom line halacha, it's mostly in accordance with the Rambam and the Sephardic approach. But here, Rabbi Moshe Isserles brings in that Ashkenazi source coming from Worms, right, the Rokeach, of using olive oil as the best possible way of doing the mitzvah. So here we've seen, just to sort of recap what we've done here, we took the passage from the Talmud doing this particular issue of inferior wicks and oils on Hanukkah. We interpreted it. We saw then how the three pillars among the Rishonim, the codes, dealt with it, the Rosh, the Rif, and the Rambam. We then saw how the son of the Rosh, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, wrote this work, Arba Turim, this great law code, which is based upon his father's code, but more expansive. And then how Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 16th century then writes a very expansive and deep law commentary on that, and then writes a kind of concise abridgment, which he calls Shulchan Aruch, which then becomes more completed when Rabbi Moshe Isserles from Poland adds the European customs to it. And the Shulchan Aruch then becomes, with Rabbi Yosef Karo's code and Rabbi Moshe Isserles' additions, becomes really the point of reference for all future discussion of Jewish law from the 16th century on. When I get back from Israel in the middle of February, so we will take another interesting issue dealing with Purim this time, and we will do the same exercise of taking a look at the Talmudic context, take a look at how it's treated by the three pillars of Jewish law, and tracing it up to the Arba Turim and the Beit Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, and by doing this several times, get a sense of how Jewish law develops, what are the great works of Jewish law, and the great personalities of Jewish law. And I want to wish everybody an amazing, fulfilling, exciting, and spiritual life full of Hashem's presence. Bye-bye.
Sure.